The War Against Women by Marilyn French. Part 1. Systemic Discrimination Against Women. If you travel around the world, especially in rural regions, you will notice that everywhere except in Muslim countries, women are doing most of the work. Two women gather seaweed on the Indian coast near Ahmedabad. They bend and rise, pulling up the greens, adding them to their pile. When they have as much as they can carry, they lug the pile up the beach to a wagon pulled over on the side of the road, dump it in the wagon, and return for more. They continue in this for hours until the wagon is full. All the while, a man sits in the wagon, head nodding in the sun, holding the reins of his horse. He does nothing. Everywhere in the Indian countryside, you see adult women so thin you would worry about them if they were your children, trudging barefoot along the dusty roads with 80-pound jugs on their heads. You spot their bright saris dotting fields where they've been weeding. But under a broad leafy tree, on a patch of grass, 20 or so men are sprawled out talking. In gleaming white shirts, you know they did not launder themselves. The grog shop, being Hindu, sells only soft drinks, but they're expensive for these poor people. Only men sit on the boxes that serve as seats in this Indian version of a sidewalk cafe. In Ethiopia, you pass a woman with a very aged body who could be any age, bent under a load of firewood twice her size. Beside her rides a man unencumbered on a donkey. On the other hand, in many cities, few women appear on the street during working hours. If you enter a Dublin pub during working hours, it is filled with men. In Italy, you become aware that a young man is following you. You stop and confront him. He has been following you all day, he says, and tells you where you have been for the last few hours. He is well dressed, works for an insurance company. He wonders if you want to have a drink. You understand he will not pay for it. In Moscow, even in the days of full employment, men loitered outside hotels, in airports, and railroad stations, waiting to sell rubles to a foreigner on the black market, waiting for something, a deal. There are more of them now. You don't see women, except on the block-long food queues. The only queues men stand on are for vodka. You don't see women on the streets of Athens either, except in the evening shopping hours. You don't see women because they are all working, at home, in offices, in factories. But you know that the men, whatever they do, however little work they do, earn more than the women. And you know that the women spend the evenings working just as hard at home, while the men sit back expecting to be waited on. Economic discrimination. The statistics presented at the United Nations Conference on Women in Copenhagen in 1980 remain true today. Women do between 2/3 and 3/4 of the work in the world. They also produce 45% of the world's food. But they are still granted only 10% of the world's income and 1% of the world's property, and part of that 1% masks male ownership, hidden for tax purposes. In the United States, property ownership is murky because most people own only a residence, usually placed in the names of both husband and wife. But the U.S. Census Bureau estimates that 16% of the property in this country is owned by women in their own right as female heads of household. And women's situation is worsening because a new world order created by a new global economic system puts men in power everywhere, even in places where women had some voice until recent decades. The entire world is linked today. Few communities exist in isolated autonomy. What links us is economics, world-scale trading. Today, almost everyone is affected by a rise in the price of oil. Droughts and crop failures have more limited impact, yet touch areas far beyond those immediately affected. All states are part of a world market to various degrees, controlled by global agencies. The World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations. The annual reports of these bodies and of national governments are based on national statistics that claim to represent a country's economic performance. In her book, If Women Counted, Marilyn Waring explains the significance of such accounts, which with the UNSNA, United Nations System of National Accounts, contain the information the UN uses to assess each nation's yearly contribution and evaluate the success of development programs. These reports are used by aid programs to identify nations most in need of help, by businesses to locate new areas for investment and choose markets, and to guide internal policies. Everywhere in the world, analyses of these statistics determine what has happened and what should happen in the future. Like a single graph claiming to contain everything important, they guide national and international plans and programs. They do not dictate policy, they are the data on which policies are based. But they are narrow, quantitative, and linear. They are guides only to economic and political exploitation. Omitting more than they include, they cannot guide users to broader social goals like well-being. They reflect not a country's actual production, but its cash-generating capacities. There are two constants about these statistics. Men make the decisions based on them, and what they omit are women, children, and the environment. The current state of the world arises from a system that puts little or no value on peace, preserving natural resources, women's labor, or the unpaid job of reproducing and maintaining human life. As Waring stresses, the system cannot respond to values it refuses to recognize. At the end of the UN Decade for Women in 1985, a report on the state of the world's women concluded that women made some gains in education, health, employment, and politics during the decade, but still bore most responsibility while men had most power. The report stated that 35% of married European women work for wages. In Africa, women do 75% of the agricultural work over and above their work fetching water and firewood, cleaning, cooking, and tending children. In Malawi, for example, women put in as much work as men raising cotton and doing domestic chores, but also do twice as much work as men growing corn. In Burkina Faso, people lose weight during the rainy season because the women work such long days in the fields, they are too exhausted to cook. And evidence suggests it is as hard for a man to prepare his dinner as it is for him to have a baby. In industrialized countries, women work 56 hours a week in the home. Women in non-industrial countries spend even more time, besides taking responsibility for procreation. Women's gigantic task reproducing the human race, supporting and maintaining it, is specifically excluded from both gross domestic product (GDP) and gross national product (GNP) statistics. Gross national product means production that generates income for a nation's residents. Gross domestic product measures production that generates income within a country, even if the resources are not owned by its residents. UN statistics now use GDP. But the United States continues to favor GNP. Women are not counted as part of the labor force because they are not paid for their work, or because men take their wages, or because their work is not considered work. Waring offers the example of the Bedi people living in the rainforest of southern Cameroon. The Bedi practice slash-and-burn agriculture, clearing 2 new half-acre fields each year and cultivating them for 2 or 3 years. Food farmers, women are the farmers in most of Africa, always have 4 to 6 fields under cultivation, growing mainly ground nuts, cassava, cocoa yams, plantains, and vegetables. Men too farm, but they raise cocoa, a cash crop and major export. Bedi men work 7.5 hours a day. They help the women raise food for an average of less than an hour a day. They work 2 hours on the cocoa plots, 4 hours making beer or palm wine or baskets, building or repairing houses, making housing materials or other simple commodities intended for sale, or in part-time wage work. Bedi women work at least 11 hours a day, 5 hours raising food, an extra hour to produce a surplus for city markets, 3 to 4 hours to process and cook food for the family, and 2 hours or more to collect water and firewood, do the washing, tend the children and the sick. Without women's work, the Bedi could not live. Yet the International Labour Organization, a UN agency, counts the Bedi man, but not the Bedi woman, as an active laborer because she does not help the head of the family in his occupation. After they won their independence from Western imperialist powers in the mid-20th century, many third world countries, abetted by Western aid agencies and corporations, sponsored projects to develop their resources. It says in scare quotes. Most development projects aim at enabling a population to earn cash by selling crops or manufactures for export or to urban national markets. In some countries, land appropriated by colonial powers was redistributed to the people, but it was almost always given only to men, and programs for raising cash crops intended for market, not subsistence, which involve instruction, gifts, or loans of seeds, fertilizers, and tools, are established for men only. Women in developing countries work harder than men, but because they merely feed society and do not earn cash, their work is valued less than men's, or not at all. After independence, African states named men head of household in census data and planning projects. This alone excluded women from national and international development programs. Men dominate the courts and legal practice, so the legal rights women do possess are rarely enforced. Kenya passed new laws protecting widows' shares in their husband's estate, but land is still commonly passed to the eldest son. Under apartheid, South African women are disadvantaged by laws confining them to overcrowded reserves, limiting their right to work and own land, and preventing them from moving to cities where they might find opportunities. Almost all development projects in Africa focus on men. Although women are the farmers in most of Africa, very little help has been channeled to them. Land reform projects transfer land titles to men, which make them eligible for improvement loans and agricultural extension services. Without title to land, women are excluded from these. African women produce not only the food people eat, but most goods for domestic use or trade. Introduction of Western manufactured goods has weakened or ended their economic independence. When the West industrialized, working class women were hired for factory work. However exploited, they could earn wages that enabled them to escape men's oppressive hold. But as industries spring up in Africa, they do not hire African women for wages or any job that allows them to accumulate capital. All African women get for backbreaking work on farms and providing goods and services in the casual exchange economy is, sometimes, bare survival, their own and their children's. Yet their work subsidizes corporate profits. Women's work supports the men working in mines, on cash crop farms, and in urban industry. In 1984, an African woman farmer ironically remarked, "This one they call farmer. Send in teachers to teach him to farm, while I'm out growing food. Lend him money for tractors and tillers, while I'm out growing the food. Promise him fortunes if he'd only raise cotton, while I'm out growing the food. No, I daren't stop working, and I won't abandon that thing I was born for, to make sure my children have food in their bellies." Farm women in Africa and India are the most overworked humans in the world, working 10 to 15 hours a day at a host of jobs. A typical Zimbabwean woman's day begins at 3 o'clock a.m. I don't know what her sources are. Every day she goes to the river for water, weeds the fields, breastfeeding her baby as she works, chases animals away from crops, pounds grain into flour, prepares meals and gathers wood, steadily walking farther with these heavy loads because drought and overcutting have depleted fuel wood. She helps her husband cultivate cash crops, processes food, threshes, dries, grinds, and carries it to market. She has weekly tasks like laundering. In the Ivory Coast, adult women's workload is twice men's. I believe it, to be honest. In Burkina Faso, women do all household work and still spend 82% more time on farm work than men. A Tanzanian man complained, "Water is a big problem for women. We can sit here all day waiting for food because there is no woman at home. Always they are going to fetch water." Women's traditional right to hold land varies from one to another African society. But in practice, most women need living husbands to get access to land. Men hold such tight control of land that a woman who cultivates land owned by a husband who works in the city is not allowed to decide what crops to plant. Most Lesotho men work in South African mines, yet their wives need their permission to start a farming operation, hire a sharecropper, or get a loan from a credit union. Because they lack land rights, women cannot get credit. In many places, they cannot even join cooperatives that control credit, transport, and marketing. Nor do they have the right to the income from cash crops, even if they raise them. Producing such cash crops often raises family income. Yet studies of projects that give men new technology to raise cash crops show that despite increased income, the family eats less and poorer food. Women's and children's nutritional levels fall because the income belongs to the men, who use it to throw prestige feasts or buy transistor radios. Men in Cameroon at least pay their children's school fees, but in Kenya, writes Irene Tinker, men gamble, buy liquor, and rent prostitutes, while their families starve. Women can no longer raise food for the family because their work and the family land are given over to the men's cash crops. In India, researchers estimate men spend about 80% of their earnings on themselves. Motorcycles, radios, watches, television sets, movies, alcohol, and prostitutes. African migrant workers send home a mere 10% of their earnings on average. Women residents in the hostels of Cape Town roll their eyes at the men's toys, as they call them, cars in various states of disrepair that clutter up the space around the hostel. In the United States, too, huge numbers of men desert wives and the children they have fathered, spending more on themselves while the family is forced onto welfare. Studies also show that when women have resources, or earn income at all, children's nutritional levels and well-being improve. Indian women, for example, consistently spend 95% of their earnings on their children. Indians have a saying, "A penny to a woman is a penny for the family, a penny to a man is a penny for the man." Yet when a Zambian tax code was amended in 1986 to give women half of a child allowance that had formerly gone to men, Zambian men complained women would waste it on perming their hair, buying makeup, and expensive dresses. Yet most Zambian men earn little and appropriate their wives' wages as their property, and most male employers exclude women from wage labor. Such lopsided systems increase male dominance and make it hard for women to negotiate or demand what they need to support themselves and their children. Because men rarely take responsibility for children, the children of the world are at risk. The most blatantly exploitive form of development is what is called sexploitation, or sex tourism, a new business, tours for men to third world countries to visit brothels, created specially for them, womaned by virtual slaves, girls, often just children, sold into bondage by poor peasant fathers. Sex tourism was proposed as a development strategy by international aid agencies. What? Maria Mize writes that the sex industry was first planned and supported by the World Bank, the IMF, and the United States Agency for International Development. Oh my God. Thailand, the Philippines, and South Korea are the present centers of Asian sex tourism. Parties of Japanese businessmen are flown to one of these centers by their companies as a reward. American workers at a construction site in Saudi Arabia, totally fenced off from the culture around them, were flown to Bangkok every 2 weeks to be serviced by Thai women working in massage parlors. Another part of the sex industry is marriage brokerage. Private companies, most in what used to be West Germany, sell Asian or Latin American women as wives, openly advertising them as submissive, non-emancipated, and docile. Both industries are maintained by a support network of multinational tourist enterprises, hotel chains, airlines, and their subsidiary industries and services. The global accounting system reveals the profundity of male contempt for the necessary in human life, treating not just women's work, but the environment as insignificant. In a damning indictment, Waring describes international environmental policies that directly affect all of us. Consider, economic statistics calculate the value of undeveloped rainforest in Brazil at $0. A standing tree offers shade and coolness, prevents erosion, and returns oxygen to the atmosphere. but it has no value in the GDP until it is cut down. Industry has polluted the earth irrevocably. Many of us or our children will die from cancers caused by environmental poisoning, or will suffer miscarriage, stillbirth, blindness, organ damage, or insanity. But unless such poisonings become widely known, as at Love Canal or 3 Mile Island, such illness is invisible to the UNSNA. In fact, while common sense dictates that illness should be listed as a debit in national income accounting, medical care and medicines are given positive value. Economists say market prices of medical treatment in this case are reflections of actual wants, but there is no way quantitatively to express wants for clean air, safe water, or standing forests, nor is permanent damage to water, air, or ecosystems included in the accounting. The only item subtracted from the GNP is depreciation on the stock of capital goods, the cost of maintaining stock like nuclear bombs. The cost of cleaning up an ecological disaster is considered an expression of society's preferences. The most devastating indication of our values is that while producing and raising children, maintaining families, and preserving the environment count for nothing in global economic accounting, war is treated as productive and valuable. In 1988, the nations of the world spent over $110 for each man, woman, and child on military expenses, overwhelmingly more than on food, water, shelter, health, education, or protecting the ecosystem. Waring explains that militarization can be measured nationally as the share of the GDP devoted to the production of military goods and services, or as the military share of a nation's budget. It is measured globally by the military share of global production and the share of international trade occupied by armaments. From 1980 to 1984, world military spending grew from $564 billion to $649 billion in 1980 prices, a growth rate of over 3.5%. Over 5% of the production of the world, 27 times more than was spent on overseas development, was spent on the military in 1983, most by industrialized countries. Global military expenditures in 1985 were $900 billion, more than the income of half the human race. Military expenditures surpassed the combined GDP of China, India, and all of sub-Saharan Africa, a sum comparable to the combined GNP of all of Africa and Latin America. Waring cites an estimate of over 70 million people engaged, directly or indirectly, in military work counted as contributing to the GDP of their countries. Military work is counted as a valuable contribution to society. Raising children is not, nor do we value keeping them alive. In the 20th century alone, the world has fought at least 207 wars that killed 78 million people. And while states glorify the soldiers who fight the wars, most of those killed in them are women and children. In each minute that passes, 30 children die from want of food or inexpensive vaccines. In that same minute, The world's governments spend $1.3 million of wealth produced by the public, between 2/3 and 3/4 of it by women, on military expenditures. This, Waring asserts, is the real war. A billion human beings go to bed hungry every night of their lives in chronic undernourishment. The majority are women and children. An average of 50,000 people a day die from starvation and the effects of malnutrition. The majority are women and children. So this is 1992. So I have no idea what it is now. Even in rich countries, chronic malnutrition afflicts millions, mainly old people and families headed by unemployed women with dependent children. In the United States, 12 million children are without medical coverage and 5 million teeter on the edge of homelessness. Poor prenatal care in what may be the richest country in the world means, writes economist Sylvia Hewlett, that a baby born in the shadow of the White House is now more likely to die in the first year of life than a baby born in Costa Rica. Such problems are commonly viewed as personal. Abandoned women are blamed for not being able to hold on to their husbands, for aging, being unattractive, or whatever faults their husbands may claim. But the problem is really systemic. Western society requires women to rear children in the isolated confines of the home. The economic and moral system of the United States requires women to take care of their families without pay, pension plan, or medical insurance of their own. The force of moral opprobrium was, and to some degree is still, exerted on women to force them into this position, backed by rules, excluding them from wage work or confining them to such low-paid jobs that they cannot afford to pay for child care. Even without external pressure, it is very difficult to earn enough to support a family and raise children at the same time. The system forces mothers into dependency on men. But neither fathers nor the state are forced to support the women who maintain society. Judges may award divorced women child support or alimony payments, but the majority of men in fact pay little or nothing, and welfare assistance is both demeaning and insufficient. And the system treats older wives whose children are grown and who may have been out of the workforce for 30 or 40 years as owed nothing, despite their years of work and responsibility for others. This discounting of women's work, which is essentially taking care of all of society, has disastrous effects on women in industrial as well as agricultural societies. Women in socialist nations have long maintained that they hold 2 jobs to men's 1, but this is the case in all industrial states. It is just more of a burden in countries lacking food, consumer goods, and labor-saving appliances. Women in rich Western states have the same problems. When they protest, men say, "What do women want?" They say they want jobs, then decide they want a baby or complain about being overworked. We told them it wasn't a tea party out here in the real world. But women are overburdened not by being in the real world, but by having 2 jobs. It seems never to occur to men that taking care of themselves and raising their children should be everyone's work, not solely women's. That overworked women have less energy and time for demanding jobs legitimates men in excluding women from them. The circle again. Transnational corporations hire third world women to work for low wages in factories and co-opt their men by making them bosses. Western women workers, too, are affected by the increasing tendency of business firms to create systems requiring almost no intelligence or skill from mainly female workers in order to pay them minimum wages for mindless jobs that deprives them of any autonomy. And economic analysts predict that in the future most women will be hired only in low-paid jobs. Men exclude women almost completely from managerial positions. In Bangladesh and Indonesia, women hold 1% of such posts. In Norway and Australia, male managers outnumber females by 3 to 1. In the United States, women hold less than 0.5% of jobs in the highest echelons of corporate managers, and only 3% of the top 5 jobs below CEO at all Fortune 1000 companies. Women earn less than 75% as much as men, doing the same or similar work. They are still 60% of the world's illiterates. And these figures are improvements. In societies that value primarily money and power, the value of a group is shown by its financial reward. Below is a breakdown of figures from the Bureau of Labor Statistics on median income in the United States in 1987, when for the first time women earned 70% as much as men. Median income. Entire population, $381 per week. All men, 445. All women, 309. Whites, 391. Blacks, 306. White men, 462. Black men, 334. Hispanic men, 316. White women, 312. Black women, 283. Hispanic women, 253. Male managers and administrators, 667. Male professionals, 628. Male technicians, 501. Female professionals and mechanics, 475. Female executives, administrators, and managers, 421. This is after 15 years of feminist agitation, begun when women earned only 59% of male wages. Demands for equal pay for equal work are a mockery when most people remain clustered in segregated jobs. Of 504 occupations listed in the 1980 United States Census, 275 were dominated by one sex, by 80% or more. And male occupations always pay more than female occupations. Partly because of job segregation, men reach their peak in earnings and prestige between the ages of 45 and 64. But women reach their peak earnings at 44 and decline immediately afterward. The most recent statistics show that in 1989, and 92, the median annual income of women between 45 and 54 was $20,466, only 59% of the median income of men the same age. $34,684. And women between 55 and 64 earn 57.7% of male wages, $18,727, compared to $32,476. These statistics, drawn from the Labor Department, Census Bureau, and other agencies' data, appear in a report by the Older Women's League, which adds that less than half the wage gap could be explained by differences in education or work experience. The figures are even more depressing if we factor in race. There has been some convergence in work experience for Black and white women, who now join the labor force at an almost identical rate. Black women have increasingly left domestic and service jobs to join white women in clerical occupations, but they continue to earn less even than white women. Okay, Marilyn, intersect. And their unemployment rates are twice white women's. Black women are far more likely than white women to live in poverty because of their lower earning capacity and because Black men earn much less on average than white men. Political analysts in the United States, discussing a swing to the right in recent decades, suggest that one factor in this shift is whites' resentment of laws that redress traditional discrimination against people of color. No analysis I have seen links it to an element that became apparent in the same period, a gender gap in voting, as women increasingly vote as a bloc against conservative candidates. Yet removing barriers to full citizenship for women affects men more intimately than removing them for people of color. Men's motivation to shift to conservatism may well be their opposition to women's increased economic power and political voice. Clearly, both women and people of color are aware of the nature of the battle, even if it is not publicly discussed. Both tend to vote for liberal candidates. The gender gap is also a color gap. One could say the gap is between white males and everyone else. But white males remain dominant. A major force in impelling the swing to the right is the new right. Marilyn Power describes this group as social revolutionaries whose doctrines center on a return to patriarchal family structure by forcing women back into economic dependency on men and rescinding legal abortion. The new right, which draws lower middle class whites by stressing a free market and white male individualism opposed to the state, helped elect the conservative administrations of Ronald Reagan and George Bush. Reagan and Bush proclaimed ideological agreement with new right anti-women policies under the euphemism protecting the family, but found them too disruptive to pursue directly. But over the last decade, their administrations undermined the gains made by people of color and women. Reagan's main agenda in office was to restructure the economy to make big capital more profitable and to reestablish the global political and economic dominance of the United States. His administration dealt with economic crisis by making massive cuts in social services, tax cuts favoring the rich and corporations, and undermining labor unions, but increased rather than cut military spending, generating a severe recession. The result was a redistribution of income from the poor working class, many of whom are now homeless indigents, to wealthy individuals and corporations, many of whom have since collapsed under the weight of their own greed. 60% of the cuts in federal entitlement programs in fiscal 1982 came from programs for the poor. Since women were already the bulk of the poor, Women and children made up 4/5 of the poorest class in America, even before Reagan. They bore the brunt of these cuts, especially women of color. In 1978, 1 out of 5 families in the United States was supported and maintained by a single parent, compared with 1 in 9 in 1970, usually a woman. Families of women raising children alone are 5.5 times more likely to be poor than those with a man present. A family raised by a black woman alone is 10.5 times as likely to be poor as the family of a white man. So these cuts only seemed sex-neutrally directed at the poor, not at women. They were in fact rooted in patriarchist theory, which is woman-hating. The idea that poverty is a result of human inferiority is rooted in the beliefs that aggressive pursuit of wealth is a characteristic of superior human beings, and that economic inequality, stratification of classes, is adaptive, beneficial to the human race. This is essentially to worship domination. Conservatives like Reagan believe that poverty is a result of personal failure, and that programs aimed at ameliorating poverty actually increase and perpetuate it by encouraging sloth in the poor. This belief masks an implicit agenda on women, which power finds most clearly articulated in George Gilder's Wealth and Poverty, highly praised by Reagan and his director at the Office of Management and Budget, David Stockman. Asserting that the keys to success in a capitalist economy are work, family, and faith, Gilder claims that poor are poor because they lack these, defining family as the patriarchal nuclear family with male head and economically dependent female homemaker. He disapproves of women working for wages because their economic power disrupts this ideal arrangement and may lead to its collapse. Dismissing the huge numbers of hungry children in this country, Gilder vehemently attacks social programs like aid to families with dependent children for their supposed effect on men. He blasts AFDC for making optional the male provider role. And demoralizing low-income men who, unmanned, cuckolded by the compassionate state, tend to leave their families. Families without men are doomed to poverty because women inevitably earn low incomes. By this logic, he would eliminate all options allowing women to live independently of men on the ground that female wage earning is responsible for poverty, urban decay, and crime. A broader logic would focus on male responsibility, not just in poor men, but those who control most of the country's resources. But blaming the victim is always safe because she can rarely fight back. An equally cruel bit of economic persecution was revealed in a study directed by Ian Ayres, a professor at Northwestern University School of Law. 6 people between 24 and 28, college-educated and well-dressed, were taught the same script and body language. The testers, 1 black man, 1 black woman, 1 white woman, and 3 white men, visited 90 car dealerships in Chicago. Despite the fact that a few of the salespeople were black or female, across the board, white men were given the best deal on their cars. The people who could most easily afford a car were charged least. Those who could least afford one were charged most. The testers found that white women were charged $150 more for a car than white men. Black men, $400 more than white men, and black women, $900 more than white men. I'm going to stop there.